So today's case is an emblematic one, well known in Argentina. It's a case that happened in March 2006, exactly on March 2nd, 2006. March 2nd is Margaret's birthday. But it had nothing to do with that. It was just a coincidence that it happened on March 2nd back in 2006 in a region called La Pampa, Argentina. It's a case also known as the La Pampa case or as the Sergio Pucheta case. It's a corporal. It happened to a police corporal named Luis Sergio Pucheta. At the time, in 2006, he was 31 years old and he worked as an exemplary police officer in Argentina. And so on that March 2nd, he was already on his way home and everything, but a colleague of his, Marcelo Villegas, called him and said, "Man, I got caught up here. I have something to do. Do you want to cover my shift? We'll settle up later." And then he agreed to do the patrol in a rural area nearby for his friend to cover his friend's absence, and they would settle things later. So around 7:30 p.m., approximately 8 p.m., he went to that area, which is about 80 kilometers from where he was. It's a place known as El Cruce de las Canas, and he went there because there are many cases of people hunting illegally in the area and also committing robberies there. So it's a place where they have to patrol. He ended up going by motorcycle. He went on his motorcycle. He was in uniform. He was on duty. So he ended up going to that place. When he got to that place, which is very remote, there are very few houses along the way. It's an endless dirt road. He noticed a kind of glow in a forest. There are two mountains in that area as well. And between the mountains, he later saw these lights and said this: "It must be some hunter over there, doing something or other." So what did he do? He stopped the motorcycle, took off his helmet, got off the motorcycle, and then he started walking over there to try to see what it was. Then suddenly he came across two strange red lights that appeared and quickly blinded him. He was kind of paralyzed, kind of stunned. When he observed those lights, he didn't know what they were, but he estimated that they were about 50 meters from where he was. Before we continue with the story, this case was also published in the book by my friend Pablo Villarrubia Mauzo. He lives in Madrid, Spain, and he published this book, Expedientes OVNI do século XXI. So on pages 407 and 408, he talks about this case of Officer Pucheta. And at the very end of the book, on page 408, he even mentions that the data from this case was compiled. They were collected by a researcher named Raul Oscar Chavez from a group called CIUFOS, which is from La Pampa in Argentina, and also a well-known American ufologist, Scott Corrales. He also conducted personal research on this case. So just giving you a tip that in this big book here, this case is also included along with other very interesting cases. Later, I'll talk about a comment that's in the book here, which Pablo published, and it's actually information that's very hard to find elsewhere about this case. But moving on, let's get back to it here. This police corporal Pucheta, he was a really honest guy, very hardworking guy, and well regarded by his colleagues and his commander. He was an experienced person who had no mental health issues, nothing that would discredit him. He was capable and experienced in what he did. In fact, he had undergone special forces training. He was a guy who would hardly be surprised by anything unusual. He would be prepared for anything. But this situation he ended up experiencing was something that traumatized him for his entire life. But let's continue here. Just giving a brief overview of who this witness was, this guy who was abducted. At that moment when he was hit by that reddish light, that beam, a very intense light, he said he could only move his hands. He was kind of paralyzed and he felt a strange tingling sensation that went all over his body. Usually, when people are hit by a beam of light from UFOs and such, sometimes this kind of paralysis and tingling happens. And then a few seconds later, he was kind of compelled to grab his weapon, the radio, the cell phone, and to take that apart. Simply as if he were being mind controlled, he started grabbing things, disassembled his weapon right there, took out the ammunition, threw it away, grabbed the radio too, took it apart, and the cell phone as well. And he doesn't remember at what moment he ended up doing that. He has a flash that at some point he might have done that. But like within this whole story, it coincides with more or less the time when he saw those lights, that he might have made a phone call to his colleague, who was Marcelo Villegas. So he called Marcelo, or I mean, I don't know, in that state he was in, kind of catatonic, he ended up calling. But at that moment, Marcelo Villegas didn't answer because he was taking a shower. So the one who answered the call was Norma, who was Marcelo Villegas' wife. When she answered and everything, later it was found out that she said it was Pucheta. But he said the following, that Marcelo Villegas should come quickly to Las Canas. Then you know what's going on. He said something like that. There was a lot of interference on the call too, but the call dropped, it disconnected there. So what happened? Norma, as soon as her husband Marcelo got out of the shower, said, "Look, your colleague, the other police officer, called and told you to go over there." So what happened? Marcelo Villegas tried to call him, but he couldn't get through anymore. He wasn't answering, so he got really worried about it. Then Villegas ended up calling 101, which is an emergency number. And in 10 minutes, the head of the local police command went there, who was a commissioner, an inspector named Roberto Osvaldo Ayala. So he went there to try to see what was happening because he said he was at that location. Then when they got to that place, they found about 800 meters from there everything that had been taken apart. So they found the radio, the gun, the ammunition, all neatly arranged there. Everything was disassembled. The cell phone was also thrown in the sand there because it's a rural area. There's even a photo, Arthur, if you want to show it, of how his things were found that day. I'll put it here. And then they started looking for Pucheta. and thinking that something might have happened, that he was kidnapped, killed, I don't know, that someone did something to him. And then seeing that their colleague was missing and the situation was really strange, they even decided to call for backup to start searching for that police officer. He was a Corporal Pucheta, and they said, let's look for the guy to see what happened. Something strange must have happened, because he wouldn't just leave his gun all disassembled, the radio, the cell phone, right there. The motorcycle was also lying on the side of the road, kind of abandoned. So due to the unusual nature of this case, they started calling other units, patrol cars, to go to the scene and look for this missing police officer. And what happened? During the search at the scene, they found a footprint. Who found the footprint? Marcelo Villegas himself, who had also gone to the scene quickly because he was worried about the situation, especially since his colleague was filling in for him. And then he found a footprint, but apparently it belonged to Corporal Pucheta. And then he started looking at the footprints, and these footprints went on for about 2 kilometers and 800 meters. Approximately. For 2,800 meters, you could see the footprints. But one thing they found strange about this trail of footprints is that at certain points, the footprints had a stride of 1 meter. Suddenly, the spacing started increasing to 2 meters apart, and it even reached up to 7 meters apart. In other words, it's as if some force, something lifted the police officer, because there's no way he could just jump like that, right? 7 meters, 2 meters, right? So the mark would remain until at the end, after about 2,800 meters, only the tips of the police officer's boot prints remained. And that's something they said. It looks like the guy is flying, because this is really strange. And there should have been marks because it was a dirt road. So usually the soul is left behind. At the time, in the police report they made, they even took pictures of the marks from the shoe from the corporal's boot there. So what happened then? They searched, walked those 2.8 kilometers and didn't find anything. What happened? They kept searching into the early hours, when around 2 in the morning it started to rain. Then a strong storm hit the area and made everything more complicated, because the downpour ended up erasing the footprints and everything else. And any trace of the police officer that might have been there. So what happened? When was the police officer found? Only the next day at 3:55 p.m., right, in another place that's far from there, known as El Triangulo, which is about 30 kilometers from where he was last seen. Right, the last time, it says here that a local farm owner there named Luis Alberto Barbeiro, he found Pucheta, Corporal Pucheta, sitting, with his hands holding his knees, right, on his legs, and with his head down, looking at the ground as if he was in shock. He was sitting on the ground there in that position, with his face hidden between his arms, right? The farmer there, Barbero, right? Luis Alberto Barbero, he thought that situation was very strange, especially because he didn't know the person who was there, and he was wearing a police uniform, right? So he got a bit worried. So what did he do? He tried to get closer. He approached the police officer, tried to talk to him, but said that he didn't say anything. He didn't utter a single word. He was there, for example, in a state of shock, right? So he didn't show any kind of reaction. And then Barbero, this farmer, this local resident, decided to call the emergency number with his own cell phone. He did this a few minutes later, right? From the description he gave of the officer, the police realized it was Officer Pucheta. And then everyone went there, right? The patrol cars, that were already looking for him and everything, not just from his department, but from other departments as well. They had already been called in. Everyone was looking for him. And then they went to that place. Then when they got there, so the first person who approached him was Chief Inspector Roberto Osvaldo Ayala. Tried to talk to him about something. There was another officer named Tic Mario. He even asked him what happened and so on, tried to ask him something. And he even has a photo, look, Arthur, of him crouched in that position, which I've already shown everyone. That's right. So this other officer there is Tiki Mario. He's patting Corporal Pucheta on the head, kind of comforting him, asking him what happened. And he said, Pucheta mentioned something, that there was something in his head, saying something like, basically something like, if you stay here, we'll come back to get you. He wanted to stay there, but no, right. He had already gone through a traumatic situation, which in a moment, I'll tell you the details, but I'm just giving you some context about what happened. So going back there, the commissioner, then the inspector, Roberto Ayala, he managed to get the corporal to stand up. When he stood up, he hugged the commissioner, the inspector, and started to cry. Yeah, inconsolable, right? He was really inconsolable there, started to cry, cried a lot, and just no. And he couldn't explain what had happened. He was in a state of shock there, right? And one thing that the police, looking there at the place where he was crouched down, noticed was that there were no footprints, right? There were no footprints showing how Corporal Pucheta got there. He was just sitting in that position and there was no way for him to get there by the road. If he had come walking or something, there would have been footprints and there weren't any, right? Another thing they found very strange is that, remember I told you guys that it rained at 2 a.m? So it started raining a lot, and this rain lasted until 1:30 p.m. the next day. In other words, a lot of water fell, and do you know how the corporal was found? Completely dry. In other words, his clothes were dry, the pullover he was wearing, the boots, everything was dry, right? It wasn't wet, soaked, nothing. Where was he sheltered all that time, right? So he was completely dry there, right? Nothing at all. And another thing that was also noticed is that there were no footprints showing how he got to that place. In other words, it seemed like someone had put him there in that spot. He stayed in that position until the police arrived and rescued him. And then the first thing the police did was say, man, let's take him to the medical center. He needs to be treated, see what happened, right? Because this is really strange. When he got to the department, to the medical center, they identified that on the corporal's feet, right, this police officer, there were burns and even blisters on his feet, right? And there were some small spots, holes, right? As if someone had punctured, made some holes in his feet, right? And then during that time, he was already a bit calmer and everything. He said he wanted to be taken to a dark room because the light, he was feeling that the light caused him severe headaches and eye pain, right? He had very strong photosensitivity and also photophobia, a fear of light, which lasted for several days, a long time for him to recover from this kind of thing. So right there at the medical center, he asked to be taken to a room and for all the lights to be turned off because he couldn't stand it. Maybe it was a trauma, a memory of that light, you know, the red one that dazzled him, that was very bright, something like that. Another thing that stood out during those exams he went through and everything else is that despite having been missing for about 18 hours and everything inside his stomach, there was nothing, no liquid, no food, nothing. It was completely empty, and given the time that had passed, it was quite possible. It was expected, you know, to find some kind of dehydration at least, but nothing like that was identified or diagnosed at that moment, right? At that moment, when he was already there at the medical center, the corporal himself already admitted that he had been taken, abducted, I don't know, by something strange, and that maybe he had undergone some kind of experience there, something, because he did mention a few things he remembered vaguely. So, quote, for example, the corporal said the following: I felt as if I was inside my mother's womb, and then I started to remember things from my childhood. That was when he was inside the craft there, supposedly. It was as if my life was in slow motion. I don't know how long it lasted, you know, that kind of situation. He also says that he saw his daughter who hadn't even been born yet. At that moment when he was abducted, his wife was pregnant. And later on, a daughter was actually born. But inside the craft, or in that completely different situation, he remembers that he actually saw his daughter already born. So these beings, or whoever abducted him, managed to project even a kind of future, right? An expanded vision of time, right? Something that hadn't happened yet, but was going to happen. And also maybe to place these memories, right? These recollections from his life since he was a child, right? He started to remember a lot of things. Maybe it was something inside the craft that triggered all of this, right? Another thing that happened that we could mention, according to the information released by the local newspaper, because it wasn't just the police who went there, the press also showed up in force, right? And they noticed how strange the case was and went there. And then news reports came out, right? In the newspapers from the region and everything. And then people were already saying, right, that he had mentioned two short beings with red eyes, right, who appeared and gave him orders without addressing him personally, right? The orders were communicated mentally, like telepathically. Um, at some point, also, Corporal, he even mentions a creature that's tall, over 2 meters in height, a tall being, and that he was quite intimidated, right, by that situation too, right? And that at some point he also described vague images from that night. At a certain moment, he saw the field from above. That is, he saw the field there, right, all that plantation and everything else, as if he were seeing it from above, aboard something, right, inside maybe, right, a craft, a UFO, some kind of unidentified object. And he saw everything lit up, right, as he was passing by. He also said that he went through a place that looked like a city, right? So maybe he was taken through some places that he doesn't remember, doesn't really know. And he said he felt an intense heat when he put his feet on the ground, explaining, right, that this was maybe the cause of the burns on his feet. In other words, to have burned his feet, he probably even took off his boots. Or I keep imagining that such intense heat would have scorched, would have even melted the sole of the boot, something like that. So possibly they did something to his feet. Also because as the medical center found some holes, right? Some marks, some puncture marks on his foot. Is it because they took off the boot and did some kind of experiment on the feet of this soldier, right? This Argentine police officer? Well, continuing the story here. So what happens? He was very traumatized by this issue. And in 2013, this was in 2006, from 2006 until 2013. He couldn't really adapt anymore, work properly. He was very traumatized. So what happened? There's a resolution, which is resolution 383 from May 2013. And then he ended up being forced into retirement because he couldn't return to work due to the trauma from the experience, right? So there was even that. They ended up retiring the police officer because of this totally unusual experience. So we don't know. We don't have any information if he underwent any kind of hypnotic regression. From what I investigated here, from what I looked into, he never underwent hypnotic regression. But starting in 2020, he began to talk about this subject more openly, more publicly, giving more information. Right, up to what he remembered about the event, because it wasn't that much either, was it? And he was very categorical in saying that he would never go through that Las Canas region again. Because that left a big mark on his life, because he was afraid to experience, to live through that situation again, which he still can't explain what really happened. So it's a case, well, we believe that an abduction must have happened. Now, I want to share with you some insights about this case, which would be the following. At that moment, when their footprints start to become spaced out, right, 1 meter, 2 meters, up to 7 meters, it's because somehow those beings were able to make him float, or the ship was trying to pick him up somehow, right? But right there, right after those 2,800 meters, right, when the footprints completely disappear, that's when he was taken inside, right? An unidentified flying object. And he went through an abduction there, through experiments, right? And he had those memories from his childhood, even memories from the future, right? Namely, him to see his daughter already born, who hadn't even been born yet. That's a strange thing. There are some cases in ufology that talk about people who saw the future, who saw things that later on were confirmed and happened in exactly the same way. For some reason, these beings, these UFO crew members, they have this ability to reveal the future as well at certain times, both the past and the future. I wanted to read a final part that I found very interesting from a note by Pablo Villarrubia in his book UFO Files, right, from the 21st century. And he says the following here. Look, when he arrived at a cornfield, uh, he noticed a tall creature that seemed to be chewing, right, or eating something there. This tall being, that he saw seemed like it was eating something from the field. He also has this statement here. Frightened Corporal Pucheta kept watching that entity, that being, when he heard, two other short beings telling him inside his head, that is telepathically, Go forward and don't go back, you know. So if he says, let's go further ahead, don't come back here, you know. So yeah, the toll being passed by him. Then he started losing his fear. He was scared, but he started losing his fear. And he told the doctors there that it wasn't some kind of animal, right? Another thing here, look, weeks later, right? Weeks later, a colleague who used to go down that road, down that path, another police officer, an access road from Agostone, he saw a strange light on the path, right? So there are some cases here, right, that were collected later that talk about lights that were seen in that same place. Look, thinking it was another vehicle, he shined his headlights on the object, then the object moved to the side and then flew away, disappearing. Right. So, yeah, it's just that it's in Spanish, right? So I'm translating it and sharing this information with you. Yeah, Raul Oscar Chavez himself, who is a researcher, a ufologist from La Pampa, he said that this region has a lot of UFO sightings, that it wasn't 2006. It wasn't the first case there, right? But as an abduction case, yes, it would have been the first case. Although Argentina, and even in that region of La Pampa as well, has already had contacts with beings, you know, small, skinny, with disproportionate heads and red eyes, right? There are at least two more cases besides the ones that happened in that region with certain characteristics similar to what happened in this case from Corporal Pucheta, right? Another thing that is relevant for us to talk about is that generally people who go through an abduction like this, yeah, they really come back totally disturbed, right? With a huge psychological trauma many times, right? Because people don't live through or aren't taught to deal with something like this. So even when it's an experienced military person, right? Or maybe, I don't know, an astronaut, a scientist, someone who knows things, even a ufologist, when they go through an experience like this, it's something different, totally outside the norm. And that's why many times psychologically, it's hard to maintain a clear line of reasoning. That's why, yeah, he couldn't work anymore, right? He retired in 2013 from 2013 on, and he couldn't adjust to police work anymore, which he always did so well, right? Just like I said in his story, he was an exemplary police officer. There was nothing against him. He didn't have any mental problems, and he really experienced something unusual. Like I said, he's a police officer. He experienced it there, right? They took something probably from his feet, blood, something, and for sure more things happened. Because it wasn't just an hour, he was lost there for 18 hours, right? Since the moment that call happened until the moment he was found. And another thing that's really unusual and made me really aware that he went through a real experience, it's that it rained really hard. You know, there was a storm in that area, heavy rain from 2 in the morning until about 1:30. Until the afternoon, you know, it rained a lot and he was completely dry. So during all that time it was raining. Where was he? Probably inside the craft, going through a lot of things. But of course, hypnotic regression might bring to light part of this experience and this abduction that Officer Pucheta went through. So it's an iconic abduction case. Well known among Argentinians, right? And also around the world, this case is already internationally known.